Hello and welcome to Module 5 of this webinar series on the Rural Access Index. These webinars are part of a TRL project with the aims of refining the methodology for RAI calculation, piloting application of the new methodology, and increasing awareness and use of the RAI in general. This presentation is part of a series of webinars produced under this project. Each webinar in the series is a maximum of 10 to 15 minutes long, and some frequently asked questions are included at the end of each module. The webinars will cover the topics shown here. This fifth in the series presents a case study of a project that TRL conducted in Malawi in 2019. We do recommend that you view these webinars in the sequence presented, but all the presentations will be made available separately and can be accessed as required. This module covers a case study for Malawi that we conducted in 2019 as part of the ReCAP RAI project. First of all, we'll look at the organizational information for Malawi, and then we'll look at road network data, population data, urban and rural boundaries, and finally RAI metadata. Understanding the roles and responsibilities of key stakeholders is fundamental to the production of statistics and indicators. The counterpart to the ReCAP RAI project was the Malawi Roads Authority. They were our starting point for the RAI measurement process. Other key players identified during a scoping exercise were the National Statistical Office of Malawi, the Ministry of Transport and Public Works, and the Department of Surveying and Mapping. The body responsible for the actual reporting of the RAI as part of the SDGs is the Ministry of Finance, Economy and Development. This diagram shows just how many different actors can be involved in the process, and this highlights the importance of coordination and cooperation between the relevant organizations and clarifies the roles and responsibilities. Okay, for data, we'll start by looking at the road network. The NSO of a country will typically not be involved in road network data collection. They usually will request this data from the relevant roads authority or authorities. The NSO's role is to report statistics provided to them by other agencies. In most countries, there are very often differences between the road network data held by agencies, the reality on the ground, and the data reported in statistics. NSO experience and oversight is important in helping formalizing processes and reporting, and in agreeing and documenting assumptions. Information needs to be defined and quality assured to a certain standard so that the NSO can endorse road network data as official statistics. This is true for any data and indicator, including the SDGs. NSOs are usually responsible for reporting the SDGs, so they need to document and understand the background data and assumptions. It is recognized by the Malawi Roads Authority that the gazetted National Road Network is out of date, and that mapping has not been updated since at least 2015. The gazetted road network is around 15,500 kilometers, but there is an additional 300 to 500 kilometers of roads constructed which are not yet included in that figure. An even bigger issue for Malawi is the approximately 10,000 kilometers of unclassified roads being maintained by NGOs that are likely to be all season according to the RAI definition. So, of course, this could have a significant effect on the RAI figure. Consolidation of the mapping would require cooperation among the Malawi Roads Authority, Malawi Roads Fund, Ministry of Transport and Department of Surveys. Currently, there is no clear mandate for any agency to consolidate road network mapping for the entire country. However, the issues are now documented and there is at least an acceptance that agencies must coordinate. So moving on to the next important data set, which is population data. In Malawi, this is the responsibility of the NSO. The Malawi NSO conducted the most recent national population census in 2018. This was geo-referenced at the household level. The NSO were not aware of WorldPop at the time, but they agreed that it could be an appropriate data source for the purposes of calculating the RAI. The NSO provided the 2018 census data at a district level so that WorldPop could regenerate 100 meter square population data to reconcile at that same level. This regeneration exercise only took approximately 1 week from the point at which WorldPop received the data. It would have been possible to do this same exercise at the level of the enumeration area, so that WorldPop data and projections would be consistent at that level. It's not yet sure whether this would make a significant difference to the RAI, but it could also be useful for other applications. Moving on now to urban and rural boundaries. As we discussed in Module 4 of this series, the UN Statistics Division, or UNSD, advises that because of national characteristics which distinguish urban from rural areas in each country, each individual country should decide which areas are to be classified as urban or rural. Many indicators, national as well as SDGs, are dependent on the urban-rural boundary, either in their definition or in any disaggregation of the indicator. In Malawi, the Department of Survey's dataset from 2015 was used to define the rural and urban boundaries. This was agreed with the NSO as the most appropriate dataset for boundaries in Malawi. Consistency of the definition across various indicators is important. In other words, all indicators in Malawi that are broken down by urban and rural areas should use exactly the same boundary data from the Department of Surveys. So now all the data has been identified, we moved on to the RAI calculation process. Annex B in the 2019 Supplemental Guidelines describes detailed procedures to calculate RAI in QGIS. QGIS is free open source desktop GIS software, but any established GIS package should have the required functionality. Once you have all the necessary datasets loaded to your GIS, the process of calculation is actually quite straightforward. So, using your road network data, you can use standard GIS operations such as classifying and filtering the network and create a 2-kilometer buffer around the roads you have defined as all season. And buffering is a very simple process in any GIS package. In a separate operation using population data, which is preferably at 100 meter squares from WorldPop, and urban-rural boundaries, you can subtract the urban areas to give a map of only the rural population. Using this resultant map of rural population, you can then subtract the 100 meter square populations that lie within the 2-kilometer buffer. This essentially gives you the total population which lives more than 2 kilometers away from the all-season road network. The RAI is then simply the proportion of that population compared to the total rural population in the region or area being considered. Accessibility factors can also be used to refine this calculation if necessary, and these are described further in Module 6 of this series of webinars. Move on now to talk about the metadata, and this is the documentation of the base data used. So the sources, the dates, the summary information, any assumptions, any known issues in data quality. And it's important that this is published along with the RAI so that reviewers and statisticians know exactly on what basis it was calculated. The idea is that anyone should be able to recreate the RAI value using the metadata provided. Metadata is stored on the custodian's SDG website, so in this case it's the World Bank Data Catalog. So in this case study, RAI for Malawi was calculated to be 63.1% based on a rural population of just over 5.5 million who live outside the 2-kilometer buffer. The metadata documents the level at which the RAI was calculated, so national in this case, and the year. Metadata also documents the administrative boundary used in Malawi. Now in some countries, of course, there can be disputes as to what is the exact border. So when calculating RAI, we have to be very clear as to which boundary set was used. The supplemental guidelines recommend the FAO Global Administrative Boundaries layer as standard for all international statistics. Here, the metadata provides information on the population dataset, so the source, which is WorldPop here, and mentions the date of the latest census, and describes some of the reconciliation exercises between the WorldPop data and the latest NSO census data. Here the metadata documents the source of the urban-rural boundaries and lists the number and total area of these. Again, this just makes it clear exactly what boundaries have been used. Metadata here also documents the road network data which was used and the date at which that data was obtained. Importantly, it gives a breakdown of the classification of those roads and the total length by surface type, so paved or unpaved. Here the metadata gives some notes explaining the rationale behind the choice of network, and also in this case some observations on previous calculations of RAI in Malawi and why they may be different from the latest calculations. It also lists any known issues with the data. So, for example, here it highlights that an additional almost 3,000 kilometers of road network mapping are likely missing from the calculations. This should prompt the Malawi NSO and roads authorities to plan to fill in those gaps in their mapping data. Here, the metadata documents the accessibility factors used in the calculation and the rationale for using these. It also documents the organizations of those involved in the agreement process. Finally, for any mapping professionals amongst us, it documents the mapping projection used, because this can be important in measuring distance on the ground. So just to summarize about the metadata, it's very important that this is published along with the RAI, so that reviewers and statisticians know exactly on what basis it was calculated, and this will help greatly in comparing and explaining any differences in RAI calculations in the future. Again, the idea is that using the metadata, anyone with the relevant experience can also recalculate the exact same value of RAI. These are the key references for the information given in this presentation, and please refer to these as necessary. So we're now going to go over some frequently asked questions relating to the topics covered in this presentation. First question is, what if a country doesn't currently report SDGs? So most countries do report some of the SDGs at least already. But whether this is the case or not, the key thing is to find out who the responsible national offices or organizations are, and to liaise with them to understand the relevant policies and plans for reporting of SDGs, including the RAI. As we've mentioned previously, for the RAI, some good places to start are the NSO and the National Roads Agency. Question 2. Why is the metadata important? It's important so that users have confidence in the rigor that's been applied to analyzing and indeed verifying the data. And it also allows the measurement process to be checked and audited by users. It also documents that the different organizations involved have agreed on the basic methodology and the input datasets. Question 3. Are there risks of relying on NGOs for datasets? So all datasets should be endorsed by the NSO, which is why it's important that the NSO is involved in defining the data sources for the country and understands the caveats or assumptions being made. We've talked about NSO endorsement of WorldPop in several of these webinars, and the other important example is the use of OpenStreetMap data for the road network. Typically, the government roads agencies collect data only for the roads over which they have jurisdiction. So, for example, the Malawi Roads Authority has data for the national roads, but there's no official source of data in Malawi for the unclassified roads, although these should form an important input to RAI calculation. The metadata for Malawi highlights that unclassified roads really should be brought into the calculation in future, and we did make some recommendations for Malawi on consolidating the classified and unclassified networks to create a national picture, but of course this will take some time to complete. At the end of the day, it's up to the agencies, including the NSO, as to what data sources they want to endorse for RAI calculation. Question 4. Is it necessary for the NSO to endorse datasets for them to be used in RAI calculations? Yes, as shown in webinar 2, the NSO will need to publish the data and then it can be reported to the custodian, World Bank in this case, who will facilitate its publication as official SDG data. Question 5. Has anyone investigated the different methods for classifying urban and rural areas applied within individual countries? And following on from this, what is the potential impact on previously reported RAI figures? So yes, it has been looked at. So for example, TRL in the final TGT2 report includes a sensitivity analysis using different data sets for population as well as for rural boundaries. So in the analysis we did, there was very little impact of using different world pop data sets for Malawi, but we only did that sensitivity analysis for one country. We also spoke about the DEGURBA methodology in webinar 4. Basically, in the 51st session of the UN Statistical Commission in March of 2020, they endorsed a new DEGURBA methodology for the delineation of urban and rural areas for international and regional statistical comparison purposes. It's not yet known what the effect of DEGURBA will be on RAI measurement. It's possible that RAI values may increase or decrease depending on where the roads are and on the relative distribution of rural and urban populations. Further research is needed to determine the impact on RAI and in fact on other national and international indicators as well.
So we have 3 additional questions on webinar number 5. Question 1. Did Malawi calculate RAI for their districts? Well, the answer is no. Within the SDG indicator framework, RAI is considered as a national level indicator. We did recommend, and we discussed in webinar 3, that RAI be considered at the subnational level as part of a district level policies. It would be very easy to calculate using the same process as shown in the supplemental guidelines. It's relevant to do that if RAI is considered as a policy indicator, as it can help distinguish areas within the country that have different levels of accessibility. Question number 2. If we have georeferenced census data, can we use that to calculate RAI? Most censuses conducted nowadays tend to be georeferenced at the level of the household. Most NSOs don't release the georeferenced survey details outside the NSO because of privacy concerns about the ability to identify individuals, and so the lowest level of detail against which most NSOs publish data is the enumeration area. If the NSO wanted to calculate RAI in-house using georeferenced census data, for example not sharing georeferenced household data outside the NSO, then yes, it could be used. Question number 3. Does QGIS offer a better platform than other GIS platforms for calculating RAI? The reason we mention QGIS in these webinars and the supplemental guidelines is because it provides a free open source desktop platform that's very capable of being used to measure RAI. It has all the basic GIS functions required. There are of course commercial off-the-shelf software packages that can be used, but some agencies don't have the commercial packages available. Part of the remit was to make calculation of RAI sustainable, so we demonstrated it could be calculated using free open source software, and QGIS worked well with this.
So that's the end of this webinar. Thanks for watching and we hope you found it useful. You can find more information on the ReCAP website and in the references provided earlier in this presentation. You can also access the other modules in this series via the ReCAP YouTube channel and on the World Bank Data Catalog website.